pirating on the high seas in this turn-based tactical roguelite. Hello everyone, StealthyShiroean here, and today I'm bringing you my review of Rogue Waters. Ice Code Games developed Rogue Waters with Tripwire Presents acting as publisher and released it in October 2024. Rogue Waters, as mentioned, is a roguelite game where you take the role of Captain Cutter in his quest for vengeance. You control a ship and crew that takes part in tactical battles of two different varieties as you complete the 3-act campaign. This pirating adventure does have some interesting highlights, even if some other aspects fail to hit the mark. Also, full disclosure, but I did receive this key from the publisher, of which I'm incredibly grateful, but it will, of course, not affect the review in any way. Without further ado, let's get to it. Starting off with the presentation, everything here looks decent. The 2D art for the story events and the character portraits look good, and felt theme appropriate to this world of pirates. Although, I wish there was more event-specific art. Many times the same art is used over and over, rather than showing you the hungry mermaids you come across, or the crazed pirate lady in the jungle. It shows you something like the open seas, or a parrot sitting on a jungle tree branch. While the art was good, it also felt incredibly generic. The same problem could be said of the different maps, units, and crew members. All of them worked to bring the world to life even as you were pillaging and killing everyone. But the biggest problem with it all is it felt like there were too few maps and enemy types. Many of the enemies, despite being different in their gameplay, looked similar to one another, which probably also has something to do with the zoomed out view in the battles. And despite the mention of sea creatures, the ones you control and the ones in story events, you only ever fight human enemies, which is a huge missed opportunity, especially given the contents of the story. And most of the fighting takes place on ships, which makes sense, but even the layout of these ships, and definitely the fort maps, felt far too alike to one another. The game could have really benefited by having some other different locales. Maybe a fight in a bar, a street alley during some shore leave, some ancient ruins hidden deep in a jungle. Many of these things were alluded to in the story event scenes, but nothing that we get to see in actual gameplay. Outside of the graphics, I was surprised to find out there was a decent bit of voice dialogue. Main story missions at particularly important parts anyway.
I'm just a common pirate afflicted by a pesky curse. Perfectly normal.
You calling me pesky? I rather like that. I like you too, pesky plums.
So, what's left? You can't find the Sea Shepherd in these notes?
I did find something promising. A map that leads to the lair
The
of
story scenes are text only, which is fine. However, the scenes where we hear the voice actors are done well and the performances add to the entertainment. One last thing I'd like to point out here is with the music. Overall, it was fine, nothing bad, but nothing memorable either. What I really want to say about the music though is that there were no sea shanties. Like, what? No sea shanties? In a pirate game? Come on. Rogue Waters' story was serviceable, but definitely lacking, especially in the ending. The narrative revolves around Cutter, a first mate serving under Captain Blackbone. He picks up a jewel that inexplicably forces him to shove it into his eye. This angers Blackbone, but before he can wrench it from Cutter's face, Cutter falls down a hole? I'm not entirely sure, but he wakes up 14 years later in some sort of underwater cove. For some reason, and this is never explained, he is greeted by the old quartermaster, Wilkes, who apparently just happened to come across Cutter's body and has a waiting crew and ship ready for a new captain. On top of that, they're all immortal now as they try to seek revenge against Captain Blackbone. Oh, and Cutter has a voice in his head who is some sort of spirit ghost thingy. This is never explained either, known as Shiv. Her sole purpose is to comment on things, make snide remarks, and occasionally help Cutter channel his newly gained powers of controlling sea creatures thanks to the jewel in his head. The characters for me all fell flat and weren't well developed. A bit in the last act of 3, the narrative tries to add in some more emotional ties and backstory, but I think this would have been better placed in the beginning of the story so that everyone didn't feel so one-dimensional. Additionally, much of the narrative felt to be more of telling rather than showing. There were quite a few beats to the story that either played out in readable events, or happened entirely off-screen instead of in a big set-piece mission. There were events that definitely should have been gameplay moments rather than merely being something you read. Finally, the ending felt nonsensical and ends with a cliffhanger, which leaves the door open for a potential sequel. Obviously, I'll be covering massive spoilers, so please jump ahead to the next section if you want to avoid them. Anyway, Captain Cutter finds out he's someone known as the Sea Shepherd, some sort of champion to the famed drowned goddess. She's the one who keeps bringing him back from the dead in order to free her children, aka the sea monsters. Cutter is okay with this, as this also helps him get revenge on Blackbone. Or, he is, up until he realizes that the goddess wants to use him to defeat Blackbone and his hunting cronies, so that her sea monsters can roam the world unchallenged and wipe out humanity. So when it comes down to it, Cutter stays his hand and decides to, instead, keep both sea monsters and Blackbone in constant check in order to never let either side have the upper hand. I have no idea how he plans to do this, since the sea goddess is literally the one who gives him the ability to control the sea monsters and keeps raising him from the dead. Why wouldn't she just let him die and elect a new champion? Oh, and Shiv decides to stick it to the goddess as well, which was weird because she was a servant of hers, but we, and she, knows nothing about her past or really much of anything at all, even when it pertains to the goddess. By the end of the game, I really wondered why she was even included at all. There are some nuggets here that could be expanded on into something that would be decent, but it just didn't work for me. Hopefully they can make a sequel and expand on their world and the gameplay, as I'll soon get to. The gameplay loop boils down to the similar rogue-lite formula. Go on a run, travel on an overworld map from point to point, with each path being slightly different. Along the way, collect new items that will help you on your run, and then either complete it or fail and go back to your hub to spend your gains on persistent upgrades to help you in your next run. Rogue Waters stays true to this, but has some unique aspects to its gameplay. So, first, when starting a run, you get a choice of 3 with varying difficulty, and one of them will continue the story. This is both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, the player gets to decide when to move the story forward or spend time farming resources and side missions to gain upgrades. However, I think the latter choice would be a big mistake, mainly because you'll be fighting the same enemies over and over. And while the variation of maps and enemies isn't that much over the course of the entire game, you'll really be cutting yourself short by only sticking to the first act. You'll probably start wondering why you're even playing the game anymore at that point. As far as the overworld map goes in a run, there's nothing special about it despite the nice looking visuals. Actually, I was a bit disappointed to find it wasn't something that was more open to sail where you want. I'm not entirely sure why I thought this would be the case, other than the visuals suggest places to explore and travel to in the far reaches of the ocean. But instead, you're limited to a few paths, as this is the case with many roguelite titles of this nature. Along these paths are story events where you learn a little bit more about the world and make a choice that may result in some sort of reward or debilitating effect. Many of these were interesting the first time through, but like many of these games, you'll see the same events over and over again. And while the choices didn't seem to have any large narrative effects, the actual events for the story in the specific campaign mission where you make the choice did seem to have some slight change to the narrative. I don't think there's any real difference in outcomes, but it was a nice nod to the player for recognizing their earlier choice. Alongside the events, there are also places to stop to repair your ship and buy items, ship modules, or new cannons. Of course, there's always the option to steal from these ports and fight the local authority to get your ill-gotten gains. But what type of pirate game would this be if there weren't any ships? And there are plenty of ships for your pirate captain to attack and board, as this is the main bread and butter of the game. The combat in Rogue Waters usually takes place in 2 stages, unless you're stealing from a port. First, it starts with the sea battle, where you're either bombarding a fort, or more commonly, attacking a vessel. It takes place in a series of 3 turns, where each combatant trades off cannon shots until the ship is close enough to board. There are a variety of cannons, and some of them can only target specific sections of the ship. being cannons, ship modules, or crew. Additionally, some cannons are only available on certain turns, like the powerful mortar being available only for the final turn of the fight. At first, I found this combat mode enjoyable and a nice change from the tactical turn-based fighting that I'll talk about in just a moment. However, as I continued playing, especially as I cranked up the difficulty, it got increasingly frustrating at times. Which, a side note on that, there are a slew of difficulties and you unlock more as you continuously win on high difficulties. This nets you better rewards with higher risks. Anyway, the ships have better cannons, modules, and crew members with higher health. This wouldn't be a problem except for the fact that almost all of your cannon shots are determined by an RNG damage range. This quickly became infuriating when you'd get some bad rolls and then be unable to finish off whatever you were chipping away at. And with only a 3-turn limit and limited action points each turn, this can quickly stack against you if you get continuously unlucky. When we examine the tactical ground combat, the entire ship combat seems antithesis to that, which admittedly might be the point. After boarding or making landfall on a fort, you select the crew members who will swing over, kick butt, and chew bubblegum, although they have no bubblegum. Tactical combat plays out with the player making all the moves to the crew members before the enemy takes their turns. Rogue Waters has an interesting mechanic that tries to mimic the back and forth nature of fencing. Many of the attacks will push the enemy back a square and vice versa. If the defensive combatant gets pushed up into an obstacle like a wall, then they take damage. If they back up into another character, then they both will take damage. This led to interesting gameplay where you're trying to set up the right angle of attacks to do the most damage. With precision being an important underpinning of the whole fight, the game allows you to undo actions all the way back to the start of a turn. This lets you use your crew to the best of their capabilities and lets the player experiment with different strategies. I like this aspect of the game a lot, which, again, is why the ship combat was so annoyingly frustrating. Because there is no RNG in the tactical mode, other than who the enemy will decide to attack. All of your moves are clearly labeled, and it's all about proper attacks, positioning, and expert use of the environment. As mentioned earlier, the maps, while varied in their layouts, do tend to feel very samey, especially since most of the fighting is always done on the deck of ships. As you progress in the game, the maps will start having obstacles and pickups the player can utilize to their advantage or disadvantage. Although, why the heck are there spike poles on all these ships? That seems very dangerously unnecessary. There's also a variety of enemies the player can come across that all have different features to them. The Alchemist can blight your crew members or heal their allies, the Anchor can bleed anyone who engages them in melee, and a slew of others that can do things like a devastating ranged attack, double attacks, etc. While the player does have a bunch of run-of-the-mill crewmates, they could also hire various specialists. These specialists level up in 3 different skill trees, which is their class-specific tree, and 2 random ones to give variation between 2 of the same class. While all of the classes were useful, they definitely weren't equal. Personally, I found the Grappler and Backstabber to be the most useful since the Grappler could throw people into obstacles, or into the Backstabber who can deal additional damage to anyone getting tossed their way. The Musketeer was probably the least useful. They had to ready their shot before they could do damage, which took a whole turn, and I felt a lot of the time the enemy would break line of sight anyway. Or the Musketeer would get engaged in melee, especially when you start fighting enemies who can do quick range attacks, or basically move right next to them from anywhere on the map. The Musketeer's shots did a lot of damage, but almost always were never worth the setup. There is a fear mechanic as well that is only present in the ship battles. If you deal enough overkill damage, then you could break the enemy's resolve and they'll surrender. However, I felt I could hardly ever take advantage of this. First, I had no idea what determined their resolve pool. Sometimes it didn't take much, and other times it would be next to impossible to break them. Although, most of the time, I would trigger them to surrender when I had already had the fight just about won. Actually, there were many times when the fights were really one-sided. In some lucky instances, I could kill everyone in the ship combat and immediately trigger a victory without doing the ground combat section. In many other instances, I would trim their numbers down so much that I could beat them all in one turn, sometimes in one action. I understand that the tactical combat takes center stage, but it really could have benefited from an auto battle option. And this is coming from playing on the highest difficulties I had available to me as well. There's a bunch of difficulty levels going from casual, normal, hard, several levels of heroic, and then 9 different ultimate difficulties. I ended the game on Ultimate 6. The game felt far too easy a lot of the time, except when I got really screwed in the ship combat section. Despite having a few close scraps, I never felt like it was difficult. For me, I don't think this was a bad thing, but it was something I still wanted to point out. Oh, there's also sea creatures you can control, being a kraken, mermaid, and giant sea snail, which you would think would be pretty cool. But it's a bit underwhelming, to be honest. First, I question the logic as to why you can't use these creatures in ship combat, especially the kraken, which seems to make so much sense. Maybe it would cause too much booty to sink down to Davy Jones's locker. I don't know. Anyway, they can only be used in the tactical combat, and they cost a very limited resource that you may or may not be able to replenish in a run. This restricts you to using the ability maybe only once in a whole run. Many times I kept saving it for the right moment, only to end up never needing it. And by sea creature ability, I pretty much only mean the kraken, which was able to deal big damage to a line of up to 5 squares. The mermaid's ability I never used once because it pushed enemies away from a square, which I never saw a use case for since I felt like I was always trying to push forward with my own crewmates. The sea snail's ability could set up another obstacle that you could push enemies into to deal damage, but I only used it a few times. This was once again because of the limited resources to call these creatures, so the kraken always felt the most useful in any given situation, even after upgrading each of these abilities. And that brings me to my final point of the gameplay, which are the upgrades themselves. Maybe I was doing it wrong, but I felt that so many of these upgrades for the ship were completely useless. Increasing the number of slots for cannons and ship modules obviously did wonders, but the starter cannons, and more specifically the starter modules, really weren't that great. Most of the modules all favored one class type, which really had me scratching my head. In the beginning of the game, you could only bring a couple specialists with you, so I had no idea why you'd want a module taking a slot that would only buff, and potentially debuff, one particular class. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to be doubling down on only taking 1 or 2 types of classes, but I always tried to take a well-rounded crew in the end and never used those modules. Some of the other upgrades also felt completely useless to me, like the entire mermaid ability line. But some other ones felt out of place, like increasing the base level for newly hired specialists. By the time a player would have enough resources to purchase that upgrade, their specialist would be much higher than what you'd get. And since they can't die, then I'm not sure why this would be that beneficial. In general, the most useful gain was leveling up your individual specialists, and the captain of course, in between runs, which really helped to increase their survivability and give them more options in the ground battles. And that brings us to the value and my final thoughts. But first, if you're enjoying the review or found it helpful, then please consider giving it a like, as that helps me out greatly with the YouTube algorithm gods, and maybe the drowned goddess as well, so I don't get eaten by a kraken or something. Rogue Waters runs for $29.99 USD, and I put just under 25 hours into the game. However, I'd say I would have gotten a lot less time with it if I wasn't trying to get some of the achievements, which started to feel like busy work, so I eventually stopped to focus on finishing the campaign. There's still more achievements and difficulty levels I can chase, so if that's something you're into, then I'd imagine there's at least 30 hours here, potentially more. Although, if you're someone who will find themselves done with the game after the campaign and only really cares about that, then you're probably looking at something closer to 15 to 18 hours. Personally, I would only recommend this game on a sale. I felt there just wasn't enough varied content here to merit the full price of the game. Much of it will feel very similar without much change to strategy, especially when you have established specialists. Rogue Waters does offer some interesting tactical combat that tries to do it a bit differently, which I really liked. The pirate theming and different style of rogue-lite, other than the typical 2D platformer, helps if you're a fan of the genre, but are looking for something different. If you played the game, let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you haven't, then let me know if it sounds like something you'd be interested in, or if you have any other questions. I hope this video helped you in some small way, and if it did, then please consider leaving a like, comment, subscribe, or whatever it is you feel like doing. Thanks for watching, and have a nice day.